Hi there, as Jeff mentioned, I'm the New Mexico State Chair for Yale. I became involved in Young Americans for Liberty when I came across the chapter at New Mexico State University during my freshman year 2 years ago. We are currently the most active political club on campus, so it's been a great ride. Thank you. Today I have the honor of introducing an esteemed individual, Radley Balko. Radley Balko is an opinion blogger at the Washington Post, where he writes the popular blog on civil liberties and the criminal justice system, The Watch. Balko's work on paramilitary raids and the overuse of SWAT teams was featured in the New York Times, has been praised by outlets ranging from Human Events to the Daily Kos, and was cited by Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer in his dissent in the case Hudson versus Michigan. Balko is also credited with bringing national attention to the case of Corey May, a black man who prior to Balko's work was on death row in Mississippi for shooting and killing a white police officer during a raid on May's home. Balko's recent feature on May was cited in an opinion by the Mississippi State Supreme Court, and his coverage of the case was profiled by the National Journal. In November of 2007, Balko's investigative report on Mississippi medical examiner Stephen Hain won second place in the investigative reporting category for the 2007 Los Angeles Press Club Awards. His work doesn't just stop there. He also authored Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces, which was published in 2013 and is on sale today in the lobby. Balko is originally from Greenfield, Indiana, and he graduated from Indiana University in 1997 with a BA in journalism and political science. He is a music buff, an amateur photographer, and an admitted dog person. Without further ado, Mr. Radley Balko.
Thank you, Marissa. Thanks also to the Future Freedom Foundation, Young Americans for Liberty for inviting me out here to Austin, or as I like to call it, Nashville Junior. Sorry. I love Austin. Off to a flying start. Here we go. So this first raid, let me set it up for you very quickly. This was in, as you can see, Weber County, Utah. The police force that you're going to see in this video is the Weber Morgan County Narcotics Strike Force. This is a raid on a guy, the roommate of a guy that they're investigating for selling meth. The guy who you're going to see in the video was not actually the person they were after. He was his roommate, as I said. It is disturbing. You're going to see an actual person get shot and killed in this video. I would encourage you to put yourself in the position of the person in the house, right? This was a nighttime raid. Imagine you're in the bedroom, probably asleep. Count the number of seconds between the time the police knock and announce themselves and until you see the person get shot. I would also, submit that the person who you're going to see get killed in this video likely did not know that these were the police, considering that he confronted them with a golf club. The guy himself had no prior criminal record. His name's Todd Blair, by the way.
Police search warrant! Police search warrant! Search warrant! Search warrant! Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Clear this house! Clear! No, what's going on? Keep going through. Clear this house, I got him. Stay with me.
I got it.
So that was the first one. The officers in that particular video were cleared of any wrongdoing. The remarkable thing is the internal investigation not only cleared the officers of any wrongdoing, they said that the officers followed all the proper policies and that there was nothing wrong with those policies. Now, if you think about the ramifications of those two conclusions, the only sort of conclusion you can draw from that is that it is perfectly acceptable for an innocent person to be gunned down in their own home due to a police mistake, right? If this innocent person, Todd Blair, was killed in his own home, if the police were following the proper procedures and there's nothing wrong with those procedures, then what you're saying is that this is an acceptable outcome. Basically, the other video was from Columbia, Missouri. You can actually find it online pretty easily. In 2011, the setup for the raid was the police had gotten an anonymous tip that there was pot activity going on in this house. They did a trash pull, which they can do without a warrant, so they went through the couple's trash. They found stems and seeds, and based on that was all the probable cause they had. They conducted a pretty violent nighttime raid with the SWAT team. They break into the house, they immediately shot and killed one of the dogs. They unintentionally shot another dog. It was a very sort of violent, dramatic raid. There was a 9-year-old kid in the house that they weren't aware of, and again, bullets are flying through the house that are unaccounted for. And in the end, they found a small amount, basically a personal use amount of pot in the bedroom. Ironically enough, marijuana had been decriminalized in Colombia, so it wasn't even enough to charge the guy with the misdemeanor. They did find a pipe near the pot. And the way the drug laws work, if they had found a pipe anywhere else in the house, it would have been legal. But because they found it near the marijuana that they couldn't charge him for, they could charge him for the pipe as drug paraphernalia. So the guy got a $350 fine. I posted that video to the Reason magazine website about 3 or 4 months after it happened. It went viral. It had a couple million YouTube views within a week, and it made international news. I thought this was really interesting because people were really outraged by what they saw in that particular video. The Columbia Police Department eventually had to shut down its phone lines, its email servers crashed, they were even getting death threats. The exception of the death threats, of course, the rest of this was very sort of encouraging to somebody who had been following this issue for a while. It was almost as if a good percentage of the country, particularly the internet generation, was seeing for the first time how the drug war is actually fought on the ground, and people were really outraged by what they saw. My favorite moment of the coverage of that raid actually came when Fox News, Bill O'Reilly did a segment on it, and he brought in the noted police militarization expert Charles Krauthammer. I'm sarcasm. And Krauthammer said, basically he said, don't judge the drug war by what you see in this video. This is not how the drug war is fought. These are rogue cops. This is an anomaly. And in fact, it wasn't. In fact, there was nothing really unusual about that video. Everything from the relatively light probable cause to the shooting of the dog to the fact that the police didn't know there was a child in the home, the nighttime raid, the fact that they found very little contraband. None of these things were particularly unusual. In fact, the only thing that was unusual about that raid was the fact that it was recorded and that the footage was actually released to the public. The raid that you just saw, the Todd Blair raid, raids like it, like the Columbia raid, happen 100 to 150 times per day, every day in the United States. That's actually a pretty conservative estimate. The vast majority of these raids are to serve warrants on people suspected of drug crimes, and the majority of those are for pot. So how do we get here? How do we get to the point where 150 or more times per day, police go barreling into homes, like you saw in that video, to serve warrants for consensual drug crimes? That's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this hour. So there's an old Cold War saying, it's commonly attributed to Winston Churchill, although I can't find proof he actually said it. But it does capture kind of a sentiment that we had at one time in this country, at least sort of when comparing ourselves with more totalitarian states. And that saying is, democracy means when there's a knock at the door at 3 a.m., it's probably the milkman. And it captured kind of this is what separated us from the Iron Curtain countries, right? In free countries and free societies, the government doesn't send armed men in black to your home in the middle of the night to enforce political crimes. That's not what we do in free countries. But I would submit that not only have we gotten very far away from that idea, with the ubiquity now of the no-knock raid, even the knocking part is optional. So a lot of you may have heard of this phrase, Posse Comitatus. It's somewhat misused today. It refers to a law passed shortly after the Civil War that prevented local police from enlisting members of the military to do basically sort of local domestic policing. But it has come to symbolize something broader today, and that's the idea that in a free society, in free countries, the military isn't used for day-to-day domestic policing. Now, if you think about it, there are good reasons for this, right? The military has a very clear stated mission. It's to annihilate a foreign enemy. The job of a soldier is basically to kill people and break things. The job of police officers are to keep the peace, to protect and serve. These are two very fundamentally different missions, and it's dangerous to conflate the two. Norm Stamper, the former police chief of Seattle, who I interviewed for the book, put it a different way, but also I think pretty eloquently. He said a soldier's job is to follow orders, a police officer's job is to make decisions. Again, these are two very different skill sets. Politicians, unfortunately, think that because both involve carrying guns and using force, that they're interchangeable, and they really aren't. Free societies have always known to keep the military out of domestic policing. In the U.S., this tradition goes back to pre-revolutionary times when the British Crown stationed soldiers in the streets of Boston to enforce the tax and import laws. And the soldiers were armed with these general warrants called writs of assistance, which gave them really broad powers to break into the homes of colonists whenever they wanted to search for untaxed goods and contraband. This led to a lot of animosity between the colonists and the soldiers. And actually, just the very fact that there were soldiers sort of billeted among the citizenry raised a lot of animosity, right? These are soldiers. Again, these are people trained to kill. These are people who are trained to win battles, and they were being put in this job of sort of tax enforcers and import enforcers. And this led eventually to violence, eventually to the Boston Massacre and the start of the American Revolution. I think this is something that the founders had in mind, that they had memories of when they created the Fourth Amendment, which is supposed to rein in a lot of these abuses. Interestingly, there are actually some restrictions on the British soldiers that we don't have today. The British soldiers, for example, were not allowed to serve these warrants at night. They were also required to knock, announce themselves, and announce their intentions before, and give the occupants of the house time to come to the door in order to avoid violence to their person and the destruction of their property. These are two restrictions that are no longer in existence today. Those restrictions were part of what was called the Castle Doctrine. And today, we commonly hear the Castle Doctrine invoked when we're talking about gun control issues, but the Castle Doctrine is much broader than that. The Castle Doctrine is this idea that the home should be a place of peace and sanctuary, and that the only way the government can violate that peace and sanctuary is, one, under very extreme circumstances. If you're harboring a fugitive, or if someone's being harmed inside the home. But even then, the Castle Doctrine required the police or the government agents to knock and announce themselves first. Today we have gotten so far away from that the knock and announce requirement is basically just a symbol if it's required at all. And the Castle Doctrine is basically dead. And the reason for that is the drug war. For most of our history, though, in the U.S., we've done a good job of keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement. We've sort of respected this tradition. There are a few notable exceptions, but for the most part, well, actually, the exceptions tended to be temporary, an uprising or some sort of civil revolt. A couple units of the military might be brought in to temporarily put them down, but it was always a temporary thing. The most extended use of the military for day-to-day and law enforcement in our history only happened once, and that was during Reconstruction after the Civil War. I would argue that was a justifiable use of the military given the circumstances, but it was also, a once in our nation's history sort of exception, hopefully. But we've done a good job of keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement. There was one time when members of both parties wanted to bring the military in to do everyday policing, and that was in the mid-1980s during the height of the drug war. And you had Democrats and Republicans that basically wanted Marines marching up and down city streets, conducting drug raids, arresting people. They wanted the Navy intercepting ships and searching them for drugs. And to its credit, the reason why this didn't happen was opposition from the Pentagon itself. Caspar Weinberger, Reagan's defense secretary, was adamantly opposed to the idea, as was this guy, Thomas Olmsted, and it was really his testimony before Congress in 1986 that really shot down this idea. And you can read the quote here for yourself. That's from his testimony, but it was really one of the few terrible drug war ideas in the 1980s that wasn't passed into law, and the Pentagon, opposition from the Pentagon was, I think, the reason why. I think part of the reason why also is the Pentagon knew the drug war was an unwinnable war, and generals and colonels don't like to get involved in unwinnable wars. So while we've done a pretty good job of keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement, what we've done a poor job of, and where we've really dropped the ball, is we've allowed and even encouraged our domestic police officers to act like soldiers and to assume the mindset of soldiers. Cops today are armed like soldiers, they're trained like soldiers, they're dressed like soldiers, and they're told, on a daily basis that they're fighting a war, whether it's a war on crime or a war on drugs or a war on terrorism. And if your objection to using the military for everyday law enforcement is that the mindset and the tactics of a soldier are inappropriate for domestic law enforcement, I would submit that it doesn't matter if it's an actual soldier or if it's a police officer who thinks he's a soldier or has been told to act like he's a soldier. It's the mindset and the tactics that are inappropriate, not whether the person gets a paycheck from the sheriff's department or from the Pentagon. So to that end, we're gonna play a little game here. I'm gonna show you some photos. And you're going to tell me if these photos are a cop or a soldier. And the idea here is to show you just how hard it has become to tell the difference. Cop or soldier? All right, a pretty educated crowd here. You guys know what you're doing. Yeah, I should really blur that star out. It kind of gives that one away. Everybody misses that one. Those are cops. Cops. Soldiers. Cops. It's an Oregon State Trooper. So, how did we get here? There are two trends, I think, that got us to where we are today. One is the rise of the SWAT team, and the other is the rise of the drug war, and I'm going to talk about both very, very briefly. That's a cop, by the way. So let's talk about the rise of the SWAT team. The SWAT team was the baby of this guy, Daryl Gates. Gates, of course, is the infamous or famous, depending on your perspective, former LAPD chief. But Gates was actually an inspector at LAPD during the Watts riots in 1965. And the Watts riots were a little different than any riots we had seen before. Despite the name, they weren't confined to one part of the city. They were sort of flaring up all over. The riots also weren't in response to one single incident. They were the result of about a generation of tension that had been built up between Chief William Parker's administration and various the communities of color in Los Angeles. The rioters were also particularly ruthless, and this is what scared Gates. When firefighters would show up to put out fires, the rioters would shoot at the firefighters. When paramedics would show up to tend to the wounded, the rioters would shoot at the paramedics. And for Gates, this resembled a kind of urban guerrilla warfare. And this was a time in our country's history where it would have been reasonable to expect that there were going to be more of these kinds of uprisings. There had been a number of other incidents that really put police across the country on alert, one of them here at the University of Texas, when Charles Whitman climbed the University of Texas clock tower and opened fire on the campus below. The Austin police did not have guns that could reach up to the top of the tower, at least with any sort of accuracy. And so Whitman was able to was given free rein to shoot at the people below. One really fascinating aspect of that story, I can't just imagine this happening today. Whitman was eventually stopped when some of these students at the University of Texas went home and got their hunting rifles and started shooting up at Whitman along with the police. And then that was able to sort of corner him or sort of isolate him until people could get up into the tower and stop him. But it was incidents like that and like the Watts riots, and there were a couple of other active shooter situations in the mid to late 60s that had a lot of police departments on notice. And so Gates came up with this idea of assembling this very highly trained, specialized, military-like police force that could respond quickly and with overwhelming force and violence to diffuse an already violent situation in order to save lives. He consulted with some Marines at Camp Pendleton, and he came up with the idea of the SWAT team. Gates came up with the acronym. It actually initially stood for Special Weapons Assault Teams. Somebody in the LAPD PR department told him you probably shouldn't have the word assault in the name, so they changed it to Special Weapons and Tactics. Interestingly, Gates first brought this idea to Chief William Parker, and Parker shot him down. Parker said he felt that this came too close to breaching this traditional line that we had between police and military. But Parker died of a stroke a year and a half later. Chief William Redden took over. Gates brought the idea to Redden, and Redden gave him the green light, and now we have our first SWAT team. The first SWAT raid comes in 1968 on a Black Panther holdout in Los Angeles. Logistically, it was kind of a disaster. They were lucky, in fact, that the entire SWAT team wasn't killed. But from a PR standpoint, it was a huge success. The Black Panthers were a group that much of America, particularly much of white America, feared. And sort of the images, or I guess a word from modern media circles, the optics of this heroic sort of police team going in and confronting this group that a lot of the country was afraid of was sort of PR gold for Gates. And it really kind of launched the idea of the SWAT team. Interestingly, the members of the Black Panthers that shot back at the SWAT team were all tried for attempted murder and various other charges, and they were actually acquitted on all charges. The jury decided that the sort of surprise nature of the SWAT raid would have put the members of the Black Panthers or the people inside could have reasonably been in fear for their lives. Maybe they thought they were being invaded. That defense probably isn't going to work today, although there have been a couple cases when it has, but in the vast majority of cases, that defense doesn't work anymore today. But there was a time when these tactics were considered so extreme that a jury would be willing to acquit people who fired back. The next raid comes in 1972 against the Symbionese Liberation Army. The SLA was a domestic terror organization. They had kidnapped Patty Hearst, the newspaper heiress, and apparently brainwashed her. There was a security footage of her holding a machine gun while they robbed a sporting goods store. And so this was kind of the big tabloid crime story of the day. Everybody was following this. And so, when the LAPD and the FBI announced that they had isolated the SLA at a townhouse in Los Angeles, there were national news crews ready to go with cameras. You can still find footage of reporters kind of ducking under cars as bullets are whizzing by. Again, logistically, it was a disaster. The SLA headquarters ended up burning to the ground and killing everyone inside, including a number of children. But again, from most of America's viewpoint, this was a huge success. Here again, you had these heroic cops confronting this domestic terror organization heroically, and now it made national news. And this really vaulted the SWAT idea into the pop culture. In 1970, we have one SWAT team in the entire country. By 1975, there are 500. Aaron Spelling, the TV producer, a few years later produced a SWAT TV show. Quickly became the #1 show in the country. If you like the fast-talking, cheesy 70s cop shows, I highly recommend it. It's wonderful. The SWAT captain's name is Hondo Harrelson, which is a great testosterone-infused name, right? And so soon we get SWAT board games and lunchboxes, Viewmaster sets, jigsaw puzzles, little die-cast SWAT mobiles that your son can use to raid his sister's dollhouse. And SWAT really sort of becomes a part of the pop culture. But for the most part, throughout the 1970s, as SWAT kind of proliferates across the country, they're still being reserved for these emergency sorts of situations. I'm not anti-SWAT team. I think there was an appropriate use for them. And that appropriate use is how they were used for the most part throughout the 70s. And that is when you have somebody, you're confronting somebody who is in the process of committing a violent crime, right, where lives are at imminent risk, when you're using force and violence to diffuse an already violent situation. That's how SWAT teams were primarily used until the early 1980s. So the other trend that's happening at about the same time is the rise of the drug war. And there are all sorts of things we could talk about with the rise of the drug war, but I want to focus specifically on the items related to police militarization. So I think you could trace the modern drug war to 1968 and the presidential campaign. The crime rates were rising across the country, drug overdoses were rising across the country, and Nixon ran this campaign to appeal to what he called the silent majority. He ran very heavily on a crime platform, proposed a lot of crime policies. The gist of the crime policies were basically to kind of appeal to Americans who were in fear of what they were seeing on the nightly news. If you want to be cynical, the idea was to make white America afraid of black crime. Cynical and probably accurate. The one policy I want to talk about that I think is particularly relevant is the no-knock raid. Interestingly, the no-knock raid was not something that police chiefs were saying they needed in 1968. It wasn't something that criminologists were saying that the police needed. It wasn't really a policy that grew organically out of policing at all. Police did occasionally conduct no-knock raids before the 1970s, but it was a situation where they would get a warrant, they would show up at the place where they're going to serve the warrant, and they would find some sort of exigent circumstance that would make them decide they needed to go in before they knocked and announced. Maybe they heard somebody getting hurt or killed inside, or maybe they looked inside a window and saw someone loading a gun. But the idea of going to a judge ahead of time and getting a pre-planned no-knock warrant was not something that was done before the 1970s. It was first introduced in New York by the Rockefeller administration, but it was proposed nationally, actually not by a police chief or a criminologist, but a guy named Don Santarelli, who was a 28-year-old Senate staffer who had no policing experience whatsoever, but was a brilliant political strategist and had been recruited to the Nixon campaign to come up with wedge issues that Nixon could use to appeal to his silent majority. And so for a lot of the country, the idea of letting the cops just sort of bust into the homes of people who were suspected of drug crimes sounded like a really good get tough on drugs policy. And so Nixon proposed this. It was kind of a central part of his campaign. He gets elected in '68. 1970, Congress passes 2 no-knock raid bills. One applies just to Washington, D.C. One applies to federal agents who are doing drug investigations across the country. Nixon had made D.C. sort of his test city, his model city for his crime policies. Congress had sort of a better understanding of their constitutional limits at the time. They knew that they could only really affect criminal justice policy in D.C. and among federal agents. But at the time, the police chief in D.C. was a guy named Jerry Wilson. And Wilson was what I would consider a pretty forward-thinking guy. He refused to implement the no-knock raid policy. He's still around. I interviewed him for the book. And I asked him why. And he said, well, look, there are 2 reasons why the police will tell you they have to use no-knock raids to serve drug warrants. One, he said, they'll say they have to use it because if they knock and announce themselves, the drug dealer will get a gun and kill them, right? It jeopardizes the officer's safety. He said, in his experience in law enforcement, nobody goes into the drug dealing game to kill cops. They go into drug dealing to make money. He said, even drug dealers know that if you kill a cop, you're going to be lucky to survive the next 4 or 5 seconds. And if you survive that, you're going to probably go to prison for the rest of your life. So that didn't make any sense to him. He said the other reason is that the police will say they need to use no-knock raids is because they have to get inside the house before the dealer destroys the drugs, or most commonly flushes them down the toilet. And Wilson said, and I love this response, he said, look, if the whole purpose of the drug war is to get the drugs off the streets, if they flush the drugs by the time you get in, you've gotten the drugs off the streets, right? So the only reason why you want to get in before they can destroy the evidence is you want to preserve the conviction. You want to preserve the evidence so that you can get a prosecution, you can prosecute the person and get a conviction. And for him, preserving the conviction of somebody who was in possession of a small enough quantity of drugs that they could quickly be flushed down a toilet was not worth what he thought was a pretty extreme and violative of civil liberties policy of letting cops just burst into people's homes. So he refuses to implement it. Wilson did a lot of other, what I would consider implemented a lot of other very good policies across Washington, D.C. Crime actually goes down in D.C. over the next 4 years. It goes up in most of the rest of the country. On the national level, it's a very different story. Federal agents are kicking down doors left and right. They're breaking into houses without warrants. They're raiding the wrong house. People are getting hurt. People are getting killed. Congress then does something pretty fascinating. Congress holds hearings on all these crazy raids that are happening at the federal level. They bring in the victims to testify. And they're so moved that they actually repeal both of the no-knock raid laws. Now, the no-knock raid is going to come back in the 1980s with a vengeance. There's been a huge trail of collateral damage ever since, and nobody in Congress seems to care. But there was actually a time in our history when Congress was capable of some shame and reflection and could admit that maybe they had gone a little too far with a particular drug policy. So you have these 2 trends kind of moving at the same time, but they're moving parallel to one another. You have the SWAT teams, but they're still being reserved for these emergency types of situations. And then you also have the rise of the drug war, but the raids, these federal raids, aren't being done by federal SWAT teams. They're being done by narcs, by federal drug agents and undercover clothes and street clothes. It isn't until the 1980s that you see these 2 trends converge and you see SWAT teams primarily used to serve drug warrants. And this is during the Reagan administration, although it was both parties really contributed to the problem. But Reagan really wanted to make the drug war metaphor very literal. At one point, he compared the drug war to the World War I Battle of Verdun, which if you've read about your World War I history with the anniversary lately, Verdun was this long, protracted, incredibly bloody battle over a strip of land that was really of only symbolic value to either side. There were, I think, 750,000 casualties, and in the end, nobody really won, although one side claims to have won. I always thought the metaphor was a lot more appropriate than Reagan realized at the time. But Reagan at one point declared illicit drugs a threat to U.S. national security. He really ratcheted up the rhetoric, really tried to dehumanize drug offenders. William Bennett, his education secretary, had later become our first drug czar, at one point on Larry King Live said he would have no moral objection to beheading drug dealers on national television. At another point, he floated the idea of suspending habeas corpus for people suspected of drug crimes. All the really terrible war on terror policies that we have today, somebody at one point thought about doing the same thing to drug dealers. Daryl Gates becomes a very prominent drug warrior. At one point, Gates, also on Larry King Live, said that drug use, not even drug dealing, but drug use, was equivalent to treason, and that drug users should be taken down the street and shot. This is a policy that he's going to walk back when his son is arrested for drug possession. Twice. But Reagan initiates two policies that are, I think, particularly relevant to the militarization we see today. One is he informally instructs the Pentagon to start giving away surplus military equipment to police departments across the country. And this policy is going to be formalized in the 1990s. We now know it as the 1033 program. You've probably read a lot about it, particularly since the Ferguson protests. But basically, this instructed the Pentagon to give away stuff that was designed for use on a battlefield to combat a foreign army. Was now being transferred to police departments across the country for use on American streets, in American neighborhoods, and against American citizens. Literally millions of pieces of military equipment have been transferred this way. We're talking, some of it's innocuous, benign stuff like computers and office equipment, but we're also talking grenade launchers and helicopters and tanks and armored personnel carriers, bayonets. Weirdly, police departments love to get bayonets from the Pentagon. The other policy Reagan initiates is he creates a series of federal grants that are solely tied to drug policing, nothing else. So if your cops go out and arrest a suspected murderer or rapist, there's no federal money connected to that. If you go out and arrest a couple of low-level drug offenders, there's federal money that you can get for each one of those arrests. I'm not sure what it is right now. The Madison paper in Wisconsin a few years ago, I think it was in 2002, they did a survey, and they found that every arrest by a Wisconsin police agency brought in about $500 from the federal government. Now think about how this plays out if you're a small-town police chief or sheriff, right? You get all this cool stuff from the Pentagon. You start a SWAT team because why not? Everybody else has one. Now you can keep your SWAT team in reserve and wait for one of these emergency sorts of situations where SWAT teams are appropriate. Or you can start sending your SWAT team out to serve drug warrants and actually generate revenue for your police department. So you get this strong financial incentive now to start using the SWAT team for everyday warrant service. You throw in civil asset forfeiture, which is another way that police departments can generate revenue through drug investigations. And now, what was a sort of once in a lifetime, or even in a big city, a few times a year phenomenon where you had to deploy the SWAT team now becomes, a situation where you're deploying your SWAT team once a week, twice a week, 5, 10 times a week. In big cities, there are now several SWAT teams, and they serve 40 or 50 drug warrants a week. This is a phenomenal change in how this kind of force is used in America. And there was never any discussion, there's never really any political debate about it. There's never, Congress never had a vote on whether or not to militarize the police. It was the culmination of a number of policies, but it was really dramatic change. I mean, if you think about it, if we go back to the 1970s, this kind of force, SWAT force, was used only when you were confronting someone who was in the process of committing a violent crime, right? Now SWAT teams are primarily used to serve warrants on people who are still suspected of nonviolent consensual crimes, right? Where before you were using this kind of violence to diffuse an already violent situation, now you're breaking into people's homes in the middle of the night. You're actually creating violence and confrontation where there was none before. And this is primarily how SWAT teams are used today. There's been a huge explosion in the number of SWAT teams and the use of SWAT teams. I'll get to the numbers in a minute. But I mentioned the rhetoric. So Reagan really kind of ramps up the drug war rhetoric. We see this rhetoric filter down to the local level. This is a quote from a sheriff in Georgia a few years ago. And note, this is a sheriff, right? And note what he's saying here. Not only is he saying we need to fight the drug war as if it were a real war. Oh, man, okay. Sorry, I have 10 minutes left. He's saying we need to fight it, like drug users were German soldiers and were storming the beaches of Normandy, not some, namby-pamby war like Vietnam. And you see this all the time. You see, former Mayor Michael Bloomberg said a few years ago, that sounds great, doesn't it? Former Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Said a few years ago, he called NYPD the 7th largest army in the world, right? There's this sort of casualness with which politicians and law enforcement leaders just sort of refer to cops as soldiers as if it's no big thing. But it does. It has an effect on the way cops sort of see their everyday jobs and their day-to-day duties. So what we see here is a massive increase in the number of SWAT teams across the country and in the number of deployments. In the late 70s, there were about 300 SWAT raids per year in the United States. By the early 80s, we're up to about 3,000. And by 2005, we're looking at 50,000 or more SWAT deployments every year in the United States. And again, the vast majority of these are to serve warrants on people suspected of drug crimes. I'm going to have to skip through some of these. The camouflage always gets me. I don't really understand why police officers would ever need to wear camouflage. One, you're not hiding when you're doing these raids, and even if you were, you're not raiding forests, right? You're raiding houses. But there's a reason why. One is to mimic the military and sort of assume a military mindset, but also because they're getting this stuff directly from the military. But it has an effect both on how cops see themselves and how the community sees them. This is a campus SWAT team at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. This is the new thing we're seeing. College campuses, I mean, they've had their own police departments for a long time, but now they're starting their own SWAT teams. Now, the justification for this is always Virginia Tech and Columbine and these mass shooting situations. There's a sociologist at the University of Virginia, Dewey Cornell, who's crunched the numbers, and he estimates that the average high school or college campus can expect to see one homicide, not even a mass shooting, one homicide about once every 6,000 years. So the idea that every campus needs its own SWAT team to prevent the next Columbine is sort of absurd. But of course, once you have your SWAT team, there's plenty of drug activity on campus to keep them busy. By the way, at Columbine, the SWAT team did show up, 2 SWAT teams, and actually by the end, I think there were 6 there, and they decided it was too dangerous for them to go inside. It's true, I'm not being glib there. So I want to talk about 2 kind of milestone moments in this story, because I'm getting a little short for time, but I think both are important. One, the first milestone moment comes in 1996 when California legalizes medical marijuana. Now, up until this point, the argument from the police officials and from the government about why they had to use this kind of force was that drug dealers are hardened criminals. They wouldn't hesitate before killing a bunch of cops. This idea was that they were facing this kind of threat, right? And there are rebuttals to those. I've already made those arguments. I've already made a couple of them. But at least the government was making the argument, right? They were saying, we have to use this level of force because of the threat that we're facing. Well, when California legalizes medical marijuana, what happens? You get pot head shops and marijuana grows and treatment centers and facilities start springing up all over the state. These are not underground criminal enterprises, right? A lot of these places have business licenses. They're openly operating. And how does the federal government respond? Well, they should respond by sending federal SWAT teams in to raid these places. And there are stories of AIDS and cancer patients getting handcuffed to their beds and having assault weapons pointed in their faces. These people were not, the hippie mom and pop couple running the head shop are not a threat to pull an AR-15 out from under the counter and murder a bunch of federal agents. So why was the government using this kind of force and violence? To make a political statement, to make an example of these people. This is not something we normally associate with free societies, right? In free societies, we give the government permission to use violence and force to protect us from threats. In authoritarian states, that's where governments use force and violence to make political statements but this was about asserting the supremacy of federal power. And we see it today. There have actually been more medical marijuana raids in the Obama administration than there were in the full 2 terms of the Bush administration. You see it in other contexts. Some of you may know about the raw milk movement or the raw food movement. Now, whatever you think about the wisdom of eating unpasteurized milk products, and I think it's kind of dumb, these are all voluntary transactions between the business and the customer. But they are openly flouting federal law. And so what's happening? The FDA is sending SWAT teams in to raid these people's homes and farms and co-ops. That's right, I said FDA SWAT teams. I'll get to that in a minute. And so this is the other kind of milestone moment, which is that now we're seeing mission creep among SWAT teams where they're spilling out even beyond the drug war. This was a case a few years ago in Florida where the police suspected there was drug activity going on in these barbershops, but they didn't have enough evidence to get a warrant, which means they really had no evidence at all. So what did they do? They called up somebody from the state's occupational licensing board who went along with these raids, and now these were officially licensure inspections to make sure these barbers were properly licensed to cut hair. They were just performing the inspections with the SWAT team. They arrested 47 people. 44 of them were arrested for barbering without a license. They did find 3 people who were in possession of drugs. I would submit that if you raid 47 businesses of any kind in a city, you're probably going to find 3 people that are carrying drugs. But here's the remarkable part. The people who were subjected to these raids had to go to court. And thankfully, 3 months ago, the federal appeals court in this circuit, I can't remember which circuit Florida's in, but actually ruled that yes, using a SWAT team to perform a regulatory inspection is unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment, right? Yay, that's great. However, there's actually a split among the federal circuits on this question. 2 other federal circuits have ruled that it's perfectly reasonable to send a SWAT team to perform a regulatory inspection. In Virginia, the case was a pool hall that was raided on ladies' night by a SWAT team that was officially an alcohol inspection. They brought somebody from the Virginia Alcohol Beverage Control Board, but they sent these face mask camouflage wearing SWAT officers in to perform this alcohol inspection. One other federal circuit has also ruled that this is perfectly reasonable. Now, if you think about that, these are regulatory inspections. These aren't even criminal inspections. This use of force that was once reserved for these emergency situations is now used for regulatory inspections. A year before the Ferguson protests erupted, there was a story out of St. Louis County that very few people noticed. There was a SWAT raid on a home for an administrative warrant for a white-collar crime. The neighbors were upset. They called the local news media. Local news media went to the St. Louis Police Department. They said, "Why did you send a SWAT team to perform this to serve this administrative warrant?" Spokesman from the St. Louis County Police Department said, "St. Louis County, every search warrant is now served with the SWAT team, regardless of the crime." I've since found out that that is not just limited to St. Louis County. So again, this use of force and violence that we once reserved for active shooter situations and escaped fugitives and riots is now becoming routine. It's become the default use of force anytime the police need to serve a search warrant. You have to buy the book to get the Shaquille O'Neal story, sorry. I want to talk about one other area, and then I'll close with an anecdote. I'm sure I'm getting short on time. So the one other area where we really see an expansion of the militarized state comes in 2003 when we get the Department of Homeland Security. And since then, DHS has been giving grants to police departments across the country to buy new military-grade equipment. And you know, the sort of justification for this is terrorism and terrorist attacks. Inevitably, this equipment is going to unlikely al-Qaeda targets like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and Fargo, North Dakota. When Fargo inevitably does not succumb to al-Qaeda, this equipment then gets used in far more mundane policing to serve drug warrants. I wish I could show you another video, I can't, but the Lenco company is one of the companies that makes this stuff. By the way, this stuff has created a cottage industry of corporations that exists solely to build this stuff for these DHS grants. Like, at least with the Pentagon program, this was surplus stuff. It was already sitting in a warehouse somewhere. You know, Lockheed isn't getting any extra money from the 1033 program. This has created a cottage industry, and inevitably, and it's already happened, these companies have opened lobbying offices in DC to make sure that these programs continue and expand. You know, welcome to the police industrial complex, the little brother of the military industrial complex. One of these companies, Lenco, markets the Bearcat. It's a very popular armored personnel carrier. I got a hold of the video that they send around to police departments across the country to market it. And I asked the spokesman for the company before I wrote about the video, you know, what's going on with these Bearcats. And he was all, you know, a Bearcat, when it shows up on a crime scene, it's much more likely to be filled with psychiatrists and counselors than it is with a SWAT team. It's like, all right. So I looked at the video that they send to police departments across the country to try to get them to buy these Bearcats. And it's a SWAT team in camouflage. It's set to AC/DC's Thunderstruck. At one point, in this wonderfully sort of phallic scene, the Bearcat pokes a hole. They put this big rod on the end of it. It pokes a hole in this building and then injects tear gas into it. You know, if my psychiatrist used those kinds of tactics, I would probably get a new psychiatrist. I'll just close with the story of Corey May, because I think it illustrates just how comfortable we've become with these kinds of tactics. So Corey May, when all this happened, was 21 years old. He had just moved into a duplex in Prentiss, Mississippi with his girlfriend and their 18-month-old daughter, who you see in this photo, basically to start a life together. Both had lived one county over. They moved into Prentiss. Corey's girlfriend worked at the chicken processing plant in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. evening all this happened, it was the day after Christmas, 2001. A police officer named Ron Jones got a tip from a local informant who we would later find out was a drug addict and an unapologetic racist, but that there was drug activity going on in the duplex on Mary Street. On the other side of the duplex would live a guy named Jamie Smith, who was a known drug dealer, in fact had charges pending against him at the time. Jones, for whatever reason, got warrants for both sides of the duplex, even though there was no evidence of drug activity on Corey's side. Neither Corey nor his girlfriend had any criminal record. There were no real drugs in this apartment. The police found a roach, basically, which would have gotten them a $50 fine under any other circumstances. For whatever reason, they raid both sides of the duplex. I'll tell you Corey's version of events first, then I'll tell you the state's. According to Corey, he wakes up at 12:30 a.m. He's home alone with his daughter. He wakes up to the sound of armed men trying to break into his home. He gets terrified. He runs back to the bedroom, pulls a gun out from the nightstand, which he owned legally, and laid on the floor next to his daughter, hoping the noises would go away. They didn't. They moved around to the back, and within a few seconds, the back bedroom door flew open, and a man dressed all in black ascended the three-step climb into the apartment. Corey fired 3 shots from his gun. He heard somebody say, "Police, police, you just shot an officer." He immediately surrendered with bullets still left in the gun. He was arrested. Actually, first he was beaten severely, then he was arrested and charged with capital murder, the intentional killing of a police officer. Corey was black, Ron Jones was white. This is in Jefferson Davis County, Mississippi, a part of the country where the race is still sort of a suffocating part of everyday life. Corey was, 4 years later, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. That's his version of events. The state's version of events is that Corey woke up to the sound of sirens in his driveway, looked out the window, saw a armed raiding team of cops coming to break into his house, decided for whatever reason, despite the fact that he had no real drugs in his apartment and had no criminal record, that he was going to take them on with his handgun. He waited for them to break in, then shot and killed just one of them, and then surrendered with bullets still left in the gun. And none of that really makes sense, right? When I asked the prosecutor if that made sense to him, he said, well, sometimes people do irrational things, which was probably more relevant, I think, than he realized. But even if Corey had a death wish or wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, why would you surrender with bullets still left in the gun, right? Nothing about that makes any sense. Corey's version that he didn't know they were cops made a lot more sense. In any case, I was researching a paper on this very issue for Cato when I read about the case, and it sort of leapt off the screen at me that something was wrong with this. I started writing about it. I'll spare you sort of the whole litigation history, but basically in 2011, the Mississippi Supreme Court threw out the conviction and gave him a new trial. Corey was not allowed to argue at trial that he was defending his daughter's life that night. The Mississippi Supreme Court said he should have been allowed to. The new trial was going to take place back in Prentiss, where the alleged crime happened. Corey had a terrible attorney the first time around. She moved the trial to a much wealthier, more conservative, whiter part of the state. I don't know what she was thinking, but the new trial was going to be back in Prentiss. I think the prosecutors realized at that point that they probably couldn't get a second conviction. So they offered Corey a plea. If he pled guilty to manslaughter, which is a felony, they would let him off with time served. He took the plea reluctantly and got out of prison and after 10 years and was permitted to go home to his kids and his family. I tell the story because there was a kind of a revelatory moment we had, one of his attorneys and I. His family threw him a party in Monticello, Mississippi, and there was a big cookout, and there was a soul food buffet, and Corey was taking kids for rides on the four-wheeler, and it was all a very joyous and happy occasion, and understandably so. But then his attorney and I started talking toward the end of the evening, and it sort of struck us as perverse that this was such a joyous occasion, right? Here was a guy who had done nothing wrong. At worst, he was a recreational pot smoker. Who was a doting father, actually, and a part of the country where a lot of kids, too many kids don't have fathers. He was a doting and attentive father, defending his kid's life that night. All around, good guy by, all accounts. He was doing nothing wrong. The state sends these armed men to his home in the middle of the night, puts him in this horrible position where he has to decide what's going on. He has to wake up to armed men breaking into his house, decide, if they're there to harm him or if for some reason they're the police who had made a mistake. Makes an error in judgment, which I think any of one of us could have made, which a lot of police officers have made in these raids and are rarely held accountable for. And because of that error in judgment, under those unimaginable circumstances, the state spent the next 4 years trying to kill him. And after that, they put him in the most violent wing of Parchment Penitentiary to serve out the rest of his life. At the end of that, after 10 years, this guy was pulled away from his family, away from his kids. His girlfriend at the time, moved on, cut off, his contact with his daughter at the time. At the end of all this, the state graciously agrees to let him plead guilty to a felony in exchange for his freedom. A sentence or a charge is going to follow him around for the rest of his life. He's still trying to get his commercial truck driving license, and the felony is standing in the way of that. And yet, after all of this was one of the happy endings. We consider this a joyous occasion that we're celebrating. It struck us that, in a just society, we would have been outside a courthouse demanding this man be compensated for all the crap that the state had put him through. And instead, we sort of thanked the state for letting him off after 10 years and letting him go home to his family with a felony record. It struck us that there was a good illustration of just how comfortable we become with these tactics, and how permissive we become in letting the state to employ them. In my book, I talk about the term police state. I don't think we live in a police state. I think if we did, I'd be in prison for writing my book, and you would all be arrested for coming to hear me talk. But for people like Corey May, for people like Todd Blair, for people who are on the receiving end of these tactics, it is a police state, because their one interaction with the police was all-encompassing, and it changed or altered or ended their lives. For the rest of us, it isn't a police state yet, but of course it would be a mistake to wait until we become one to complain, because by then it's too late. Thank you.